Welcome to the Appalachian Historical Review. This is the audio home for AppalachianGenealogy.com. Each week, we dig into the records, migration paths, and the real stories of the people who settled the Appalachian Range. We're here to look at the actual documents and the everyday lives that define our heritage. Now, let's step into the records and look at what the documents themselves reveal.
What if I told you that back in the late 1500s, the British Empire used a spooky campfire story about a mythical Welsh prince as a literal, legally binding real estate deed to claim North America?
I mean, it sounds completely absurd on its face, right? But it is actually one of the most effective pieces of geopolitical propaganda in human history.
It really is. And it all starts in the misty, myth-filled valleys of the Appalachian Mountains. So welcome to this custom deep dive crafted just for you. Today, we are unpacking a really fascinating stack of research.
Yeah, we've got decolonial academic papers from UCLA, historical state park documents, and some incredibly detailed archaeological studies.
Exactly. And our mission today is to examine how regional legends, specifically the Moon-Eyed People, the Wampus Cat, and the Mothman, have shaped Appalachian storytelling. But more importantly, we're going to analyze how early settler narratives systematically co-opted these stories to rewrite Indigenous history.
Right, because it really reframes the entire concept of a myth.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because whether you are a history buff, a folklore lover, or just, insanely curious about how spooky urban legends actually function as tools of political power, this dive is going to completely change how you view the monsters hiding under the bed.
Yeah, they aren't just entertaining stories to tell in the dark. I mean, they are intricate mechanisms for communities to deal with the unknown and to process historical trauma.
So let's start by establishing the baseline lore of the region, specifically from Cherokee oral tradition. You've got the Moon-Eyed People.
Right, which early ethnological texts like James Mooney's accounts from 1902 and Benjamin Smith Barton's records from 1797 describe in detail.
Yeah, they describe this distinct race of people living in the mountains. They were incredibly small, essentially pale-skinned, and had these large blue or white eyes. But their defining characteristic was that they were entirely blinded by the sun.
Blinding sunlight.
Right, so they were strictly nocturnal. They lived deep in the Appalachian cave systems and only came out under the glow of the moon.
And that biological adaptation to the landscape is key here. The deep forests, the extensive limestone cave networks, the shadows of the mountains, it all directly dictates the parameters of the folklore.
Before we look at how settlers twisted that, though, we have to look at another massive Cherokee legend that suffered a similar fate, the Wampus Cat.
Oh, the Wampus Cat is such a great example. There are two main threads to this legend, right?
Yep. One is a moral cautionary tale about a woman who hides under a mountain lion pelt to spy on a sacred male-only medicine ceremony.
Which is a huge boundary to cross.
Huge. And as punishment for breaking that spiritual boundary, a medicine man magically binds her to the pelt forever.
It's a classic transformation narrative. It reinforces community rules and spiritual boundaries.
Exactly. But the second thread is much more heroic. It's the story of a Cherokee woman named Running Deer. Her village is terrorized by an evil entity known as Ua, the spirit of madness.
And to defeat it, she doesn't use weapons.
Right. She uses a traditional booger mask and channels the spirit of a mountain cat to terrify and banish the demon.
We should probably clarify what a booger mask is for those listening who might not be familiar with Indigenous ceremonial practices.
Good point. It sounds like a Halloween thing, but it's really not.
No, not at all. Think of it as a deeply symbolic ceremonial tool. In traditional Cherokee dances, these rough, exaggerated wooden masks were used to represent outsiders or evil spirits.
Often European colonizers or rival tribes, right?
Exactly. The dance was a way to satirize, process, and ultimately ward off negative external influences.
It is just a very sophisticated cultural allegory. But here is where the settler dynamic comes into play. When European settlers arrived and heard the story of the Wampus Cat, they completely stripped away all of that nuance.
They just flattened it out.
Totally flattened it.
Yeah.
They didn't see a complex moral tale about spiritual boundaries. They just turned it into, hey, watch out, there's a big spooky six-legged cat monster out in the woods.
What's fascinating here is the psychological reflex of those early settlers. They were entering a landscape that was entirely alien to them, but deeply inscribed with centuries of Indigenous history.
And to make it manageable, they oversimplified it.
Right. They severed the stories from their cultural roots and just turned them into simple biological monsters.
Which brings us back to the Moon-Eyed People. Flattening a spirit into a monster is one thing, but the settlers weaponized the Moon-Eyed People.
Weaponized is the perfect word for it.
Early settlers, including John Sevier, who became the very first governor of Tennessee, wrote about the Moon-Eyed people in the early 1800s as literal historical fact.
And they tied this nocturnal race to actual physical ruins in the mountains.
Yes. If you were to hike up to Fort Mountain State Park in Georgia today, you would see exactly what they saw. Right at the crest of the mountain, there is a staggering, zigzagging stone wall.
It's massive, like 850 to 900 feet long.
And it's built using dry masonry. That means there's absolutely no mortar holding the stones together. Just brilliant engineering, varying between 2 and 6 feet high and up to 16 feet thick in places.
It is a monumental undertaking of labor and architectural planning.
Today, the site has this incredibly romantic aura. In the 1930s, the Civilian Conservation Corps built a lot of the park's infrastructure, including a beautiful 4-story stone fire tower.
The stonemason Arnold Bailey, right?
Yeah, he actually carved a stone heart into the masonry for his sweetheart, Margaret. They were married for 59 years. It's a great modern love story layered on top of an ancient mystery.
But when those early European settlers saw that massive zigzagging wall, their modern brains immediately looked for a functional European explanation.
Because of its sheer scale, they assumed it was a military fort, and Governor Sevier and others attributed it to the pale, moon-eyed people.
But when modern archaeologists finally excavated the Fort Mountain site, they found what researchers call a loud silence.
Explain that, because usually archaeology is about what you dig up, not what you don't.
Well, humans are essentially walking garbage factories. If a site was used as a military fort or a long-term settlement, you are going to find material evidence.
Like broken pottery, discarded tools, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Weapons, charcoal from cooking hearths, animal bones. But at Fort Mountain, archaeologists dug down and hit bedrock and thin soil. Nothing else.
Wow. So no one was living there. No epic battles against nocturnal albinos.
Right. Through the lens of archaeology, this total absence of habitation debris means it wasn't a fort at all.
When researchers compare it to similar regional sites like Tennessee's Old Stone Fort, they date it somewhere between 30 and 500 CE, right?
Yes, and the consensus is that it was built by pre-Columbian indigenous peoples as a ceremonial boundary. It likely aligned with astronomical events like solstices.
So the lack of trash isn't a failure to find evidence.
The lack of trash is the evidence. It proves the space was sacred and intentionally kept clean.
Okay, so if the archaeology points definitively to an advanced indigenous ceremonial structure, how do we get from that to a 19th century governor claiming a lost race of pale people built it?
This is where the UCLA decolonial papers we reviewed get incredibly illuminating.
Yeah, the settlers introduced the Welsh Indian theory. They started claiming that the pale moon-eyed people were actually the descendants of Prince Madoc of Wales.
It is just a staggering leap of logic.
It's wild. Supposedly, this Welsh prince, Madoc, fled a civil war in Wales in the year 1170, sailed across the Atlantic, and landed in Mobile Bay, Alabama.
And suddenly colonial accounts are just filled with stories of Welsh-speaking Native Americans.
Like the account from 1666 by a preacher named Morgan Jones. He claimed he was captured by the Doeg tribe, and they only spared his life because he prayed aloud in Welsh, and the chief understood him.
Which, from a linguistic and historical standpoint, disintegrates the second you look at it closely.
Totally. But the decolonial framework asks us to look past the factual inaccuracy and ask why. Why did the settlers insist on this story?
Why force a 12th century Welsh prince into the ancient history of Georgia and Tennessee?
Because acknowledging reality was a threat to manifest destiny. You and I have talked before about Cahokia, that massive Mississippian city near modern-day St. Louis.
Oh, yeah. At its peak in the 11th century, it had 40,000 people and a 100-foot earthen pyramid.
It was larger and cleaner than London was at the exact same time. But admitting that the indigenous peoples were capable of that level of architectural and societal brilliance completely destroyed the colonial narrative.
Precisely. The justification for colonization was that the Americas were an untamed, primitive wilderness.
Inhabited by savages who weren't properly utilizing the land?
Right. If you admit that the people you are displacing built cities larger than your own European capitals, the moral justification for taking their land just evaporates.
So they invent a psychological loophole, the mound builder myth.
Yes. By attributing these marvels to a lost white race, settlers could sidestep the uncomfortable truth.
It allowed early Appalachian communities to justify their expansion. They could say, oh, we aren't stealing native land. We are simply reclaiming the lost architectural heritage of our own ancient European ancestors.
It is the ultimate historical gaslighting.
And it goes all the way up to the crown. You mentioned the geopolitical propaganda earlier. Dr. John Dee, an advisor to Queen Elizabeth I, actually used this prince-matic myth.
He used it as a formal legal argument to the Queen.
He argued that because a Welsh prince discovered America centuries before Columbus, England had a rightful inherited claim to North America.
One that superseded Spain's claim. It is the weaponization of folklore on a global scale.
So basically, this mythical 12th century Welsh prince was used as a retroactive real estate deed for the British Empire. They laundered their land grab through a ghost story.
Laundering a land grab is the perfect way to phrase it. And this psychological need to sanitize history didn't just disappear when the U.S. was founded.
No, the guilt just mutated into modern urban legends.
Which perfectly bridges the gap to the 1960s and takes us to Point Pleasant, West Virginia. The Mothman.
A legend most people are probably somewhat familiar with.
Yeah, if you're listening to this, you likely know the Mothman basics. The glowing red eyes, the wings, the bizarre sightings in 1966 and 1967.
And it all culminated in an absolute tragedy. The collapse of the Silver Bridge.
A catastrophic infrastructural failure that killed 46 people during rush hour.
It was a communal trauma that really demanded an explanation.
But the sources focus on the local lore that immediately sprang up. The community connected the Mothman and the bridge collapse to something called Cornstalk's curse.
Hokulesqua, known to colonists as Cornstalk, was a very real, prominent Shawnee leader.
Right, and in 1777, during Lord Dunmore's War, he went to Fort Randolph under a banner of truce and was brutally murdered by American militiamen.
And the modern legend claims that as he lay dying, he cursed the land.
A curse that supposedly lay dormant for 200 years until it summoned the Mothman and tore down the Silver Bridge.
This is where the academic analysis of folklore becomes razor sharp. The research introduces two critical concepts here. The logic of elimination and settler moves to innocence.
Let's break those down because this feels like the core of the whole phenomenon.
Well, the logic of elimination suggests that for a settler society to establish itself, it fundamentally must eliminate the original inhabitants.
Either physically through violence or culturally through assimilation.
Exactly. But engaging in that elimination generates a tremendous, often subconscious society guilt. So the culture moves to innocence.
Narratives and myths that absolve the modern settlers of that historical guilt.
You called it psychological money laundering earlier, and that fits perfectly here too. You take the dirty history of stolen land and wash it through a supernatural myth.
That way the current inhabitants can inherit the landscape completely guilt-free. Because Cornstalk never cursed anyone, did he?
Not at all. There is zero historical record of a curse. The Indian curse trope is entirely a settler contrivance.
It turns the indigenous victim of a historical war crime into a monstrous, supernatural bogeyman.
If the Native American is a magical, vindictive monster casting centuries-long hexes, then the settler community gets to play the role of the innocent victim.
It retroactively justifies the original violence. That is incredibly dark, but it makes so much sense.
And the research points out that this mechanism of erasure applies to the entire cryptozoological ecosystem around Point Pleasant, even the men in black.
The MIB, who supposedly harassed the Mothman witnesses in the 60s, the papers argue they are just modern sci-fi reimaginings of European fairy lore.
Right. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the men in black function exactly like the Irish AOC, the fairy folk who appear out of nowhere, enforce strange rules, and abduct people.
So the settlers literally imported their European ghosts and dressed them in mid-century government suits.
To replace the native spirits of the landscape? Yes. And when they couldn't replace them, they biology washed them.
Modern cryptozoology often takes complex indigenous spiritual entities, like the Haudenosaunee concept of the flying head, and flattens them.
They strip away the cultural context and reduce a sacred belief to an undiscovered biological animal.
Oh, it's not a spiritual entity, it's just a giant undiscovered bird we call Bighoot or Mothman.
It is the ultimate colonial act. It colonizes the imagination by telling indigenous peoples their beliefs are invalid, unless they fit a Western biological taxonomy.
But the psychological acrobatics go even further. Some of the modern lore casts the Mothman as a thunderbird or a totem Mothman, acting as a guardian, trying to warn the residents about the bridge.
And analyze what that specific narrative achieves. If this ancient, vaguely indigenous spirit is now a benevolent guardian for the descendants of the settlers, It acts as the ultimate psychological pardon.
It's a comforting fantasy where the spirits of the displaced native peoples magically forgive the descendants of the colonizers.
Wow. When you strip away the glowing red eyes, it is really just a community desperately trying to process its own historical shadow.
It really is.
But taking off the sociological hat for just a second, going back to the Moon Knight people, is there any factual biological truth to what the Cherokee were describing?
Actually, yes. The research offers a very plausible biological explanation that has nothing to do with lost European races. Albinism.
Really? Just a localized genetic trait?
Yes. Genetic conditions like albinism, which causes pale skin and severe ocular sensitivity to sunlight, appear globally. But in certain Native American tribes, the genetic frequency is astronomically high.
Like the Kuna people in Panama, right?
Yes, they are sometimes culturally referred to as children of the moon. And tribes in the American Southwest, like the Hopi and Zuni, have albinism rates over 100 times the global average.
So a localized population with a high rate of albinism living in the shaded valleys and cave systems of Appalachia completely fits the Cherokee description.
Without requiring a transatlantic voyage from a mythical prince, exactly. They would simply be indigenous people who adapted to their genetic sun sensitivity by adopting a nocturnal lifestyle.
But regardless, modern scholars entirely reject the lost white race theory.
It holds zero archaeological or historical weight.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, today? We've gone from the Wampus Cat to ancient stone walls to a 1960s flying monster. How does this change how we view the Appalachian landscape?
It means that legends are fundamentally artifacts of culture. Even if the Welsh theory is propaganda, these stories have cemented themselves into the heritage of Appalachia.
They actively shape contemporary perceptions of the landscape. If you go to Point Pleasant today, there is a massive 12-foot metallic Mothman statue that draws thousands of tourists.
It's an entire economy. And similarly, hikers exploring the ancient ruins at Track Rock Gap or Fort Mountain still feel that aura of ancient mystery because of these stories.
The legends serve a vital, ongoing social function.
They help modern communities process the unknown, make sense of devastating tragedies, and quietly navigate the unresolved guilt of settler colonialism. They are mirrors.
That is the perfect way to synthesize it. The monsters we see in the woods are just reflections of the anxieties we carry with us.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for joining us on this custom deep dive. We have traveled from Cherokee folklore to the sacred stone walls of Fort Mountain.
We unpacked how the British Empire laundered a land grab through Welsh colonial propaganda.
And we ventured into the psychological money laundering of the Mothman and Cornstalk's curse.
It truly is a testament to the enduring power of storytelling.
It really is. And I want to leave you with a final lingering thought. If modern historians can look back at the myths of the 18th and 19th centuries and clearly see they were reflections of settler anxiety and political ambition,
what will future archaeologists deduce about our society?
Exactly. When historians in the year 3026 analyze the urban legends and internet cryptids we are creating today, what hidden fears and societal guilt will they uncover?
That is a brilliant and slightly chilling question.
Keep questioning the stories you hear, especially the ones that seem to easily justify the way things are. Because diagnosing the soul of a culture isn't as simple as reading an X-ray. You have to learn how to read the shadows.
Thank you for listening to this installment of the Appalachian Historical Review. Remember to visit the digital archive at appalachiangenealogy.com. Join us next time for further study into the records and history of the Appalachian region.